my mom said. "We sold your car to help your brother, you don't need it anyway." I nodded and left. A week later, when they needed a ride, I just smiled and I stood in the driveway, staring at the empty space where my car used to be. At first, I thought maybe I had parked it somewhere else. Maybe I had forgotten. But no, the oil stain on the pavement was right there, dark and unmistakable, marking the exact spot where I had left it the night before. A bad feeling curled in my stomach. I walked inside, my footsteps slow, careful. My mother was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she stirred something on the stove. My father sat at the table, flipping through the mail. Neither of them looked up when I entered. "Where's my car?" I asked, keeping my voice level. My mother didn't even pause what she was doing. "Oh, we sold it," she said lightly, as if she were telling me she had picked up milk from the store. "Your brother needed the money." I blinked. "You what?" My father sighed, setting the mail down. "Look, you don't need a car that much. You mostly take the bus to work anyway. And Brian, well, he's in a tough spot right now." It made sense. My hands curled into fists at my sides. Brian. Of course. The golden child. The one who had always needed just a little more than everyone else. A little more attention. A little more patience. A little more forgiveness. And now, apparently, a little more of my car. I took a slow breath. "You sold my car," I repeated, making sure I had heard them right. My mother finally turned around, giving me one of those placating smiles she always used when she expected me to just go along with whatever they decided. "It's not a big deal, sweetheart. You're good at making things work. You'll figure something out." I could feel something inside me tightening, something bitter, something sharp. But I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just nodded. "Okay," I said. My father looked surprised at my lack of reaction, but my mother smiled, relieved, as if I had already forgiven them. I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and into the cold evening air. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew one thing. They had just made a mistake. I didn't go back inside for a while. Instead, I walked. I didn't have a destination in mind, just needed to put some space between myself and them before the anger bubbling under my skin became something I couldn't swallow down. They had sold my car. Without asking. Without warning. And the worst part? They expected me to just accept it. I ended up at a bus stop, staring at the empty street ahead. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father had been right about one thing. I did take the bus to work most of the time. But that wasn't the point. The car had been mine. I had worked for it, paid for it, maintained it. It wasn't theirs to take. I clenched my jaw and checked the bus schedule. Fine. I could adapt. If they wanted to believe I'd just figure something out, then I would. But not in the way they expected. The next morning, I started making arrangements. I talked to a coworker, David, who lived a few blocks from me. He agreed to let me carpool with him for a while. I adjusted my morning routine to match his schedule, earlier than I liked, but manageable. Public transportation covered most of what I needed otherwise. I took the bus when I had to, walked when I could. It wasn't convenient, but it worked. And most importantly, I didn't ask them for a thing. For the first few days, my parents didn't seem to notice anything had changed. My mother was as cheerful as ever, humming while she cooked, as if she hadn't completely undermined my autonomy. My father still read the newspaper at the kitchen table, acting like everything was normal. And Brian? Brian acted like nothing had happened at all. I saw him once, lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He didn't even look up when I walked past. No thanks. No acknowledgement. Nothing. That was when I knew I wasn't just angry. I was done. Let them think I had accepted it. Let them think I had moved on. Because when the time came for them to need something from me, I'd be ready. And I wouldn't be nearly as generous. A week passed. I stuck to my new routine, carpooling, taking the bus, keeping my distance. My parents didn't ask how I was managing without a car, probably assuming I had just figured it out. Like always. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, their turn came. I had just gotten home from work, setting my bag down when my mother's voice rang through the house. "Sweetheart, can you give us a ride?" I glanced up from where I was unlacing my shoes. My father was standing near the door, already holding his coat, and my mother had that expectant smile she wore whenever she assumed I'd do something without question. I blinked at them. Slowly. A ride? I repeated. Yes, she said, as if it were obvious. Your father's car won't start, and Brian took mine. We need to get to an event downtown. I stood up, stretching a little, acting as if I had to think about it. Oh, I said finally. I'd love to help, but I don't have a car anymore. The way their faces fell was almost comical. My father frowned. What do you mean? Just take. He stopped, realization dawning. That's right, Dad. The car you sold? The one you decided I didn't need? Gone. My mother's smile faltered, but she tried to recover. Well, can't you ask one of your friends? I mean, it's just a quick ride. I shook my head, barely suppressing the smirk tugging at my lips. I don't want to inconvenience anyone. Besides, I've been taking the bus. You can't be serious. My father muttered. I shrugged. You were right, Dad. I didn't need the car, remember? Silence. I could see it sinking in. The realization that, for once, they couldn't rely on me to fix their problem. That I wasn't going to swoop in, drop everything, and help like I always did. Brian walked in just then, tossing his keys onto the table like he owned the place. What's going on? He asked, glancing between them. We need a ride. My father said stiffly. Brian shrugged. I just got home. I'm not going back out. I bit back a laugh. My mother turned to me again, her voice a little softer now, almost pleading. Come on, sweetheart. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. I tilted my head. Like how I wouldn't have wanted my car sold without my permission. The room went quiet. My father sighed, rubbing his temples. Stop being petty. Just help us out. Petty. Right. Because standing up for myself, for once, was petty. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. I'd love to chat, but I have a bus to catch. And with that I walked out. For the first time in years I didn't feel like the one being taken advantage of. I felt like I had finally won. I took my time getting back that night. I stopped by a coffee shop, let the rain drizzle against my coat as I walked from the bus stop, enjoyed the rare feeling of knowing I didn't owe anyone anything. By the time I got home, the house was quiet, but the energy inside was different. Tense. I barely had a chance to set my bag down before my mother appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. Was that really necessary? She asked. I sighed, already knowing where this was going. What are you talking about? She gave a dramatic little shake of her head, like she was disappointed in me. Leaving us stranded like that. I almost laughed. Stranded? They weren't lost in the middle of the desert. They were standing in their own home, fully capable of calling a taxi, a rideshare, or figuring something out like I had been forced to. But of course, that wasn't the point. The point was, for the first time, I had said no. You and Dad didn't seem too worried about stranding me when you sold my car. I said evenly. That was different. She said quickly. Your brother needed help. And I didn't? She hesitated, as if she hadn't considered that before. You always manage, she said, as if that was supposed to make me feel better. You're responsible. Brian isn't like you. There it was. The same excuse they'd used my entire life. Brian wasn't like me. Brian needed more. Brian had potential. I had heard it all before. I'm tired of that excuse. I said, my voice calm but firm. You sold something that belonged to me, without my permission, and gave the money to Brian. And now, because of that choice, you didn't have a ride tonight. That's not my fault. That's yours. My mother exhaled sharply. You're really going to hold this over our heads forever? I shrugged. Just until I get paid back. Her eyes widened, like the idea had never even occurred to her. We don't have that kind of money right now. Neither did I said. But that didn't stop you from selling my car, did it? She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in a long time, I watched as my mother, who always had a way of twisting things in her favor, struggled to find the right words. Good night, Mom, I said, stepping past her and heading for my room. The guilt trip had officially begun. But this time, I wasn't buying a ticket. The next morning, I woke up to a group text from my mother. "Mom, we need to talk as a family tonight. Be home for dinner." I stared at the message for a long moment, debating whether to even respond. I already knew what this was, a last-ditch effort to make me feel bad, to convince me that I was the problem for not blindly accepting what they had done. I didn't reply. When I got home that evening, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken tension. My father was in his usual seat at the kitchen table, arms crossed, looking irritated. My mother was setting plates down with just a little too much force, while Brian was slouched on the couch, looking completely unbothered. "Sit," my father said the moment I walked in. I raised an eyebrow but pulled out a chair anyway. My mother sat down across from me, folding her hands together like she was about to deliver a carefully rehearsed speech. "Sweetheart, I think we all need to clear the air." I didn't respond. I just waited. My father sighed and leaned forward. "Look, we understand that you're upset about the car. But the way you've been acting, ignoring us, refusing to help, it's unnecessary." Unnecessary. I let out a quiet laugh and shook my head. "You don't get it, do you?" My mother sighed like I was being dramatic. "We just need to move past this." "No, you need me to move past this," I corrected. "Because for the first time, I'm not letting you walk all over me." My father's expression darkened. "We are your parents. You need to show some respect." "I showed respect," I said calmly. "When you sold my car without asking, I didn't yell. I didn't fight. I figured out my own way to get around. But now that you need something from me, you suddenly care about fairness?" The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. My mother reached for a softer approach. "Sweetheart, we're family. Families help each other." I scoffed. "Right. Like how I helped by buying my own car, but instead of respecting that, you took it from me to help Brian?" Brian finally decided to chime in, stretching his arms like this whole conversation bored him. "You're being ridiculous. It's just a car. You'll get another one." I turned to him, my patience officially gone. "Then give me my money back." He blinked. "What?" I leaned forward. "The money you got from selling my car, give it back. Since it's just a car and all, that shouldn't be a problem, right?" His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I nodded. "That's what I thought." My mother rubbed her temples. "We can't just give you the money right now." "Then I guess this conversation is over," I said, pushing my chair back and standing up. "You're acting like a child," my father snapped. I met his gaze without flinching. "No. I'm just done being treated like one." And with that I walked away, leaving them to sit in the mess they had created. After that conversation, the house turned cold. My parents stopped trying to guilt me directly, but the silence spoke louder than any argument. My mother barely acknowledged me. My father grumbled under his breath whenever I walked past. Brian, as usual, acted like nothing had happened, like the problem had magically disappeared just because he chose to ignore it. But I didn't care. I kept carpooling, taking the bus, managing on my own. And every time they needed a favor, help with groceries, a ride, money for something, I just smiled and said, "Sorry, I can't." By the end of the week, I could see the frustration building. They weren't used to this version of me, the version that didn't fold under pressure. And that made them uncomfortable. Good. By the weekend, the tension had reached its peak. My mother was slamming cabinets a little too hard, my father barely spoke to me, and Brian just kept coasting along, untouched by any of it. I could feel it coming, the moment they would finally snap. It happened on Saturday evening. I was in my room, scrolling on my phone, when there was a knock at my door. Before I could answer, my father walked in, arms crossed. "This can't go on," he said firmly. I looked up at him, unimpressed. "What can't?" "This petty attitude," he snapped. "You're part of this family, and families don't hold grudges like this." I scoffed. "Families also don't steal from each other, but here we are." His jaw tightened. "We didn't steal. We made a decision for the family." I stood up, leveling my gaze with his. "No. You made a decision for Brian. At my expense." My mother appeared in the hallway, wringing her hands. Sweetheart, please. Let's just fix this. I leaned against my desk. Okay. Pay me back. Then we're good. They exchanged a glance. My father sighed. You know we can't do that right now. Then you don't get to tell me to fix anything. Brian strolled by the doorway, yawning. Man, you're still mad about that? You really need to let it go. Something inside me snapped. I stepped past my father and stood right in front of Brian. Give me the money. Brian rolled his eyes. I don't have it. I let out a short laugh. Of course you don't. Because you're used to everyone else paying your way. That's enough. My father barked. I turned to face him. No, what's enough is me being treated like I don't matter. So let me be clear, I don't owe you anything. No favors, no rides, no help. If you need something, ask Brian. Brian scoffed. Whatever. My mother's voice wavered. We just don't want this to ruin the family. I shook my head. This family was ruined the second you decided I was worth less than him. And with that, I walked out of the house, leaving them speechless. After that, things didn't go back to normal. My parents stopped trying to argue, but the tension never left. Dinners were quiet. Conversations were forced. Brian kept acting like nothing had changed, but I saw the way he avoided me now, like he knew he had finally pushed too far. I didn't care. I was done playing my role in their cycle. Then, a few days later, my mother tried one last time. She knocked on my door softly, like she didn't want to spook me. Sweetheart, she said, her voice gentle. Can we talk? I sighed but let her in. She sat on the edge of my bed, wringing her hands. We miss how things used to be. We don't want to fight anymore. I studied her carefully. Do you miss me? Or do you miss what I did for you? Her mouth opened, but no words came out. That told me everything I needed to know. I nodded slowly. Then there's nothing left to talk about. For the first time, I saw something shift in her expression, like she was realizing, too late, that things wouldn't be the same again. She left without another word. The next morning, I overheard my parents talking in hushed voices. We should have handled it differently, my mother murmured. It's not our fault he's being stubborn, my father replied. He'll come around. I shook my head. No, I wouldn't. That night, Brian came home late, laughing on the phone with a friend. Yeah, man, it was great. Used the cash my parents gave me. No worries, they'll help me out again if I need it. That was it. The final straw. I packed my bags. When my mother saw, she looked panicked. You're leaving? I nodded. I should have done this a long time ago. She reached for my arm. But we're family. I stepped back. No. Family doesn't do what you did. For the first time, she looked truly afraid. Not because she was losing a son, but because she was losing the person who always cleaned up their messes. Without another word, I walked out the door. The air outside felt different, lighter, freer. For years I had been the one they leaned on. The one who always picked up the pieces, who never complained, who let things go for the sake of keeping the peace. And where had that gotten me? Used. Taken for granted. But now I was done. I loaded my bags into my coworker David's car. He had offered me a spare room until I got my own place. As I closed the trunk, I saw my mother standing on the porch, arms crossed, a deep frown on her face. You're really doing this? She said, voice laced with disbelief. I met her gaze, calm and steady. Yeah. I am. She shook her head. And what happens when you need us? I gave a small, almost amused smile. That's the difference, Mom. I never needed you the way you needed me. She flinched, but I didn't stay to hear whatever excuse or guilt trip she had prepared. I got in the car, and as David pulled away, I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the family's safety net. And it felt amazing. It took time, but I built something for myself. A place where I wasn't just the responsible one, or the one who figures it out. I was just me. My parents reached out, of course. Calls, texts, half-hearted apologies when they realized I wasn't coming back. But I never responded. They had made their choice. And this time, I had made mine. To anyone in the same position, it's okay to walk away. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. Because the second you stop, they'll find another match. And you'll finally be free.